Imagine, if you will, a world in which a genocidal nationalism took charge of a country, expelled its population, and criminalized public mourning for those events. Sounds sinister, right? It is, sadly, just what nationalism does when it wins the day, as it has in Israel. Today is Nakba Day, which commemorates the 1948 destruction of Palestine. Trying to honor that memory in Israel can be met with everything from a loss of state funding to arrest and prosecution for inciting terrorism. And somehow, it never occurs to anyone the way this kind of suppression directly parallels the scourge of Holocaust denial. And go figure, the people who deny the Shoah are, like the Zionists who deny the Nakba, radical ethno-nationalists and racists. But what is the Nakba? Thankfully, more and more people are aware, but I want to run you through it in a few minutes in case it is new to you or you'd like a little more detail. And for anyone new to these parts, my name is Liam O'Mara, and I'm a professor of Middle East and European history and an expert in extremist ideologies and political violence. Of the forms of Zionism developing in the 19th century, the most vicious was that proposed by the ethnic nationalists, who sought a political Jewish state instead of establishing themselves in Palestine as a cultural or religious community. They sought to seize the land for themselves and create an ethnocracy on it, a Jewish state. Think about what it means to say that, because Jewish state is said constantly in this country's media, and I don't think people are considering what it means. A country by and for Jews means a country in which non-Jews are second-class citizens at best and an overtly oppressed minority in practice. This would be intolerable even where an ethnic group was a pre-existing majority, but in a settler colony built on dispossession, it is an offense to all human decency. But why proceed that way? The short answer is that we're dealing with 19th century minds infected by white supremacy, scientific racism, and imperialism, and in those contexts, it was neither unusual nor unexpected. What is difficult to grasp is why we continue to tolerate it and support it in the 21st century. The founders of Israel wanted a democracy, but an ethnic democracy in which Jews were an overwhelming majority, and the only way to get that was to expel the native population. This is what they understood themselves to be doing at the time. People lie about it now and claim that Zionism is reversing Arab colonialism, but that is an even more offensive racist lie. At least the founders knew that they were attacking an indigenous people and admitted it. Mental preparation for this goes back at least as far as Herzl, who was himself deeply racist and argued that the Palestinians should be kept in a miserable state so that they could be bribed to abandon their homes and move to another country. Arguably, it started earlier, as in Pinsker's work you can already see the adoption of European racist discourses, but Herzl's was the first clear argument for dispossession. This continued to build up over the first half of the 20th century, and by the time the British considered and ultimately rejected the idea of partition in 1937, the World Zionist Organization under Chaim Weizmann and the Mapai under Ben Gurion were agreed on taking anything offered to them and using it as a basis to conquer the rest of Palestine. By the 1942 Biltmore meeting, Ben Gurion and other ethno-nationalists on both left and right executed an effective coup inside the Zionist movement to aim at a fully Jewish state over 100% of Palestine. This left binational groups like Brit Shalom out in the cold. That movement had argued for a state with equal rights for Jews and other Palestinians in a country that protected and sheltered them both. Many quit the shared institutions of the Zionist movement over this, but from this point, those voices calling for equality and coexistence were marginalized, and planning for a war of conquest was well underway. The village files were assembled over many months of research by Zionist Orientalists, which is what we used to call experts in the Arab world. These mapped out the location of Palestinian villages, their resources and disposition, and, where possible, documented the location of veterans in a 1936 Arab revolt, since revenge attacks were desired by many. In the lead-up to the end of the mandate, with the UK turning over its completely bungled Palestine mandate's fate to the new United Nations, Palestinians could see the writing on the wall. Global opinion had shifted on the question of the Jews after the events of World War II and the Shoah, though the bases for that shift were still anti-Semitic and Judeophobic. Countries like Germany and the United States saw in the Zionist movement a way to solve the Jewish question by making it someone else's problem and removing Jews from Europe. In April 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine, with no mention made of a Palestinian state in part of it, but direct mention of a Jewish state. Given public statements in support of Jewish self-determination and no mention of the rights of Palestinians, which had been guaranteed in earlier things like the Balfour Letter, Palestinians began lashing out at Zionists at the same time that Zionists were lashing out at the British to push them out. These two processes fed off of one another, with Palestinian attacks fitting into Jewish generational trauma and the recent experience of the Holocaust, and the British growing tired of the whole thing and unwilling to commit the money and lives needed to maintain order in their Palestine mandate after the grueling experience of the Second World War. For much of the last year of the mandate, British troops and police refused to intervene as Zionists killed Palestinians and Palestinians killed Zionists, and the first efforts at terror-driven expulsion began in December of 1947 with the Al-Qisas raid, authorized by Yigal Allon and privately celebrated by David Ben-Gurion. Houses were destroyed in the middle of the night, with families still sleeping in them. Events like this started the process of mass exodus, with people fleeing with their children in terror. Many other events like this were to follow. One of the most famous of these was Deir Yassin, where in early April of 1948, members of all three major Zionist militias attacked a village near Jerusalem. At least 107 were killed. Some people were raped. Some survivors were paraded in Jerusalem only to be attacked by jeering crowds and killed. Even in places where the local Zionist officials were calling for calm, like in Haifa, saw violence in this period. Local militants did things like pour fuel oil on the streets and set them ablaze, then used snipers from the high ground to shoot Palestinians as they came out to extinguish the flames. Much of Haifa's Palestinian population would flee over the course of the year, with many later drowning in panicked rushes for boats in the harbor. Earlier plans by the Zionists, especially by the labor militia Haganah, had been more defensive, but by Plan Gimel they were engaged in reprisal raids that expelled whole villages, killed Palestinian leaders and veterans, and destroyed transport infrastructure and resources. Plan Dalet made this considerably worse by authorizing the direct expulsion of the entire Palestinian population. Most often this happened by surrounding a village on several sides and then firing into the air or beating people, with the result that the population fled through the way left open to them. Before Israeli independence was declared in May of 1948, 200,000 people had already fled their homes. This process greatly accelerated with the beginning of the 1948 War of Independence. 6 regional Arab powers contributed troops and volunteers, often aiming to defend Palestinian villages and towns, but frequently failing to achieve much of note. The only truly professional force on that side, the Jordanian, had already had a secret deal to divide the hill country and so avoided most combat entirely. While leaders like Ben-Gurion were crying out in public that another Holocaust was imminent, in cabinet meetings they understood the Arab forces were no real threat and concentrated on expelling the Palestinians. The earlier intimidation tactics of Plan Dalet were the order of the day, but coupled with more frequent massacres and assaults on Palestinians. These could be as horrible as forcing people to choose men and boys to be shot. Rapes were documented in Israeli archives. About 70 separate events reached the definition of a massacre, totaling perhaps 15,000 killed. Some events are noteworthy. At Al-Zaytun, a Palestinian man was forced to pick out 37 village teenagers to be shot in front of them. A stampede in Haifa resulted from 200 fleeing Palestinians being shot dead. A water source leading into Akko was deliberately contaminated with typhus, causing an epidemic in that city. In total, 11 urban neighborhoods and 531 villages were depopulated. Most of the villages were dynamited to remove traces so that new migrants need not see the bones on which their country was built. At least 750,000 people were expelled from their homes between December of 1947 and December of 1948. This is what we mean by the Nakba. This is the Palestinian catastrophe. For one nation to rise and dominate the land, another nation had to be destroyed. This is the tragedy of Zionism, that its drive to create a Jewish state came at the expense of an innocent people. But it's not just the events of that year that matter, for the Nakba has been an ongoing process. Dispossessions and killings have continued for 75 years, and little effort has been made to grapple with or address the crimes of the state's founding. This is akin to the way that Turkey denies the nationalist crimes of the late Ottoman Empire, or the way the US denies the nationalist crimes against Native Americans. Genocide is genocide, no matter who is doing it, and nationalist movements have a psychological incentive to rationalize and deny. It is up to us to make them uncomfortable and prevent that denial. If there is ever to be peaceful coexistence in the land, then there has to be remembrance and healing. By continuing to deny what was done to Palestinians, Zionists are engaged in an act of national erasure and delegitimization. And given the Palestinians are often literal descendants of Samaritans and Jews who assimilated under the Romans and later Arabs, it is a fratricidal conflict that takes aim at one of the oldest settled populations on earth. Palestine deserves to be free. A Jewish culture also deserves to live on the land, but not as a Jewish state. It should not be controversial to oppose apartheid and ethnocracy in the 21st century. But not only is Israel clamping down on freedom of expression, so are Germany and the United States, two countries guilty of countless millions of racist murders in their own multiple genocides. There is a reason these countries have to deny the Nakba, as it challenges their nationalist and racist ideologies. In thus honoring the Nakba, we remember not only the Palestinians who died or were made homeless, but the countless millions killed and forgotten due to ethno-nationalist movements. To support Palestinians is to support humanity and the causes of dignity and justice. It is to say never again about genocide and actually to mean it.